This is Australia, the home of footy, and of course, footy. And this is not Australia, this is New Zealand. Despite being over 2,000 kilometres away, as well as being part of a different FIFA confederation, two teams from New Zealand's North Island make the at least 4-hour flight every other weekend to compete in the Australian A-League. But why? The A-League is already spread across this gargantuan area, so why make things even more gargantuanan? Who signed this off? Don't the Kiwis have their own football league? Surely the Aussies could have cobbled together a couple more sides. A New Zealand side just won the championship? Wait, they might be adding a third New Zealand team? I have a lot of questions. Context. Historically, association football is not the most popular spectator sport in Australia nor New Zealand. In fact, it's not even the most popular form of football. While the beautiful game would spread rapidly across the world throughout the early 20th century, Australia and New Zealand went their own way. It was Victorian/Aussie rules and rugby league in Australia, rugby union in New Zealand, and blitzball in Auckland. Oh, hang on, wrong script. Though that's not to say nobody played soccer. In fact, organised local competitions had been running as early as the 19th century across both countries, so not exactly without heritage. Due to the relative isolation from the rest of the soccer-playing world, the sporting authorities of the two nations took one look at each other across the Tasman Sea and said, "Yeah, you'll do." In 1905, a team representing New Zealand would embark on its first tour of Australia, and the first proper internationals between the two countries took place in 1922, in what would soon become a regular series of matches as the two countries competed for the Soccer Ashes. Until they lost the thing. The bromance between the two FAs was most evident in the 1960s, when both Australia and New Zealand were denied entry into the Asian Football Confederation, on account of them, not being in Asia. So instead, they decided to form their own confederation in 1966, along with the football associations of Fiji and Papua New Guinea, the Oceania Football Confederation, of course. While the associations of both countries were attempting to garner recognition on the international stage, the domestic game lagged behind. Football was splintered into amateur, regional and local competitions and associations. In New Zealand, calls for reform began as early as 1959, when two members of the New Zealand Football Association, Mr. O. Hilton and Mr. J. Houston, described the FA as being part of the old order and proposed a unified national league to be competed in the 1960 season. While it did have backing from players and supporters, some of the regional associations were resistant to this sporting change. For instance, the Otago FA stated, "New Zealand has not the population for this scheme. Distances are so great, and, at the moment, the time is not opportune," before adding that this step towards a more professional structure would be the death knell to club football. It would take away all the players into one team and affect the standard of clubs' teams outside the league. Which, funnily enough, was the same argument clubs in Britain were having 70+ years earlier. And to be fair, he did have a point. In 1960, New Zealand had a population of around 2.4 million people, spread around an area roughly double the size of England. Support was hard enough to come by as it was. Cities like Wellington, despite having a population of just over 200,000 people, had 10 senior clubs, which meant local talent and cash from spectator income was spread thinly around. The proposal was ultimately shot down, but would remain in a zombie-like state throughout the 1960s. The idea of a national league was floated once again in 1963, and while it was agreed in principle by 23 votes to 15, it eventually collapsed after clubs and the FA realised the costs of running a national league were well out of their budget of 2 pints of Spates and a jar of Marmite. The New Zealand Football Association tried again in 1965 by proposing that existing teams in many of the nation's urban centres should unite to form super clubs. But once again, buy-in from the regional associations wasn't universal. Eventually, the dream of a national competition would be achieved in September of 1969, when members of the New Zealand Football Association voted in favour of kicking off a brand spanking new National Soccer League in 1970. Composed of 8 clubs from across the country for the inaugural season, supported by 3 regional divisions that would provide the basis for promotion and relegation amongst clubs. The financial burden of running such a huge undertaking would be softened somewhat by the league's primary sponsor, Rothmans Cigarettes, because nothing screams top athletes than a 40-a-day smoking habit. To be fair, this was par for the course for sports at the time. Cricket, tennis, Formula 1, they were all at it. The Rothmans Soccer League? I'm not calling it that. The National Soccer League kicked off in April 1970 and would pave the way for, about that. New Zealand's new Super League started strongly enough. Attendances were well up across the board in comparison to what had come before, with 1,500 in attendance to watch Christchurch United's loss against Blockhouse Bay, and 2,300 at the Eastern Suburbs versus Hungaria match. While those figures barely rival an English National League fixture nowadays, it was as much as several times greater than normal attendances, and particularly impressive for the time when you take into account that these games were also televised live. So infused by the initial attendances that the National Soccer League announced its intention to create a second national division barely days after the initial round of fixtures. Give it a rest, lads. Throughout the 70s, the league continued to grow both in size and popularity. 12 teams would compete in the competition by the end of the decade, and interest in the National Soccer League would reach its peak following New Zealand's qualification for the World Cup in 1982. But, I assume to the surprise of no one watching this video, its popularity wouldn't last forever. Over the next decade, the league suffered from financial problems caused by falling attendances, increased costs of running football clubs, and the withdrawal of their principal sponsor Rothmans in 1986. By the early 90s, it was clear to the New Zealand FA that the league in its current form had about as much life as zombie Linda McMahon, and would spend the rest of the decade tinkering with the nation's flagship soccer competition. They tried reverting back to the regional format, but that was binned after 3 seasons. They tried moving the competition to the summer to avoid competing with rugby union. That also didn't work. They even tried splitting the league into 2 separate North and South Island mini-leagues, with the winners from each section competing in a grand final. That survived a year. As the end of the millennia loomed, it looked as though New Zealand didn't have the audience to prop up a fully professional setup. But developments across the ditch would change things drastically. Meanwhile, across the Tasman, domestic association football in Australia had lived its own topsy-turvy existence. Soccer had experienced a boom courtesy of the influx of migrants from Europe in the aftermath of World War II, something that was also evident across the ditch in New Zealand. Historically, the domestic game in Australia was centred around British heritage, which you can see in the boring names they gave to teams like Royals, Corinthians and Blue Balls, Bells. However, post-war migration changed the footballing landscape completely. Displaced European populations began establishing highly competitive clubs that were also social societies, essentially helping new arrivals find their feet and settle into their new lives in Australia. These migrant clubs had much more exciting names like Concordia, Olympic, Stallions, and Wilhelm Scream. Oh, that's Wilhelmina. Though, as you might suspect, the relationship between the established amateur clubs and new migrant sides wasn't exactly serene. A schism between the 2 sides would eventually result in the Australian Soccer Football Association getting booted from FIFA on account of these migrant clubs poaching talented players from Europe without compensating their old clubs, and lead to the formation of the similarly named but totally separate Australian Soccer Federation in 1961. While the new federation sought to modernise the game, it would be some time before a unified national competition took shape. Boffins would launch the National Australia Cup in 1962 as an interstate knockout tournament. But the competition was binned after 6 years due to the ridiculous cost of travel. Imagine getting drawn away at Perth. You'd be livid. Despite the failed experiment, the idea of an Australian national competition didn't fade away, and would receive a shot in the arm courtesy of the Australian men's national team's qualification for the 1974 FIFA World Cup in West Germany. The squad, which was essentially a band of part-timers plucked from the various state leagues, went and showed that Australian soccer had, it had some kind of potential. However, this breakthrough highlighted the flaws of the domestic game, which just couldn't offer the kind of week-in, week-out high-level football needed to keep up with the rest of the world. Enter Alex Pongrass, president of St George Budapest, and Frank Lowy, president of Hekoa Sydney and obsessive shopping mall developer. Much like Hilton and Houston in New Zealand, the two began championing a brand new National Super League composed of clubs from every corner of the country. Well, this corner of the country more accurately. When the Australian National Soccer League finally got the green light in 1977, it marked the first time any football code in Australia managed to put together a kind of National League competition. Sponsorship from Philips kept the coffers full, and an inaugural 14-team season saw clubs from Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, Canberra and Brisbane. However, much like the National Soccer League in New Zealand, the National Soccer League in Australia struggled in growing its supporter base and its commercial revenues. And to draw further parallels with New Zealand's Premier Division, league organisers tried anything in an attempt to get more eyes on the product and put bums in seats. Move the season from winter to summer to avoid competition from other sports? Tried that. Move to a northern and southern conference, but for some reason stick your two most geographically northern clubs in Brisbane with the southern clubs in Victoria? Yep. Americanise team names and identities to make them appeal to a wider audience but end up alienating your existing fanbase? Sure. For the majority of Australians, the NSL was still on the fringes. A foreign sport associated with the ethno-European rivalries of its clubs, which at a time when soccer hooliganism was on the rise in the UK and the rest of Europe, didn't do much to improve its image. And most certainly didn't help when those scenes which had played out on the evening news were performed live on Australian soil in 1985, when a match between Sydney Olympic and Sydney City at Pratton Park would descend into a full-on riot. Blimey. To compound this, in a sporting environment where the best in the world from the other football codes, rugby league and Aussie rules, competed in Australia, the National Soccer League looked a little pony by comparison, particularly when you take into account that not even the best Australians stuck around the NSL. Instead, you had the likes of Harry Kewell, Mark Viduka and Mark Schwarzer moving to Europe and often ending up at Premier League clubs, which, by the way, was now being televised in Australia. The Australian footballing landscape shifted again towards the end of the 1990s. The European community clubs that had replaced the old amateur clubs in the 1960s would now make way for privately owned franchises with off-brand Pro Evolution Soccer-esque sounding names, such as Brisbane Strikers, Canberra Cosmos, and, for the first time, a team from Western Australia, Perth Glory. Perth Glory was born from the ashes of Perth Kangaroos, a club that was formed in 1994, for some reason competed in the Singapore Premier League, won the thing, then said, "I have to go now, my planet needs me," and dissolved in 1995. But despite being a financial train wreck, a businessman by the name of Nick Tanner took a look at the smouldering flames and saw some potential. He repackaged the Kangaroos with enough pizzazz and convinced the Australian Football Association, Soccer Australia, to give Perth Glory the green light to enter the National Soccer League in 1996. Regardless of effectively being a brand new team in the most remote city on planet Earth, Perth Glory was a hit. Thousands flocked to see NSL football in the club's inaugural 96-97 season, and the success of the club soon got Australian football officials mulling over how they could replicate the glory of glory. Which other markets could they possibly take this franchise model to next, I wonder? Given that Perth was over 2,000 kilometres away from the next nearest NSL club, The obvious choice was to find a market that was just as far away in the other direction. Soccer Australia saw an Auckland-based franchise as the perfect way to tap into a market of over 1 million people, expand the NSL's television coverage, as well as presumably find an excuse to expense the odd trip to New Zealand. For New Zealand football, the benefits were clear. While their own national competition was in a state of flux, a franchise club competing at a higher level would help push soccer into the mainstream, while also providing a pathway for Kiwis to develop against a higher calibre of competition. Well, that was the idea anyway. In 1999, the Football Kingz with a ZFC were born. How do you do, fellow kids naming aside, the Kingz were New Zealand's first proper professional football club, created not to compete in their own league system, but the Australian National Soccer League instead. Their inaugural match on October 1st, 1999, at North Harbour Stadium against Carlton, drew a record crowd for a club game in New Zealand, marking the beginning of a new era for Kiwi football. An era of being constantly skint and generally stinking up the joint. The club was immediately in the financial from the word go, born out of infighting within the board, and had to be bailed out by Sky Television less than a year after their first match. On the pitch, things were just as bad. Despite a respectable mid-table finish in their first 2 seasons, the Kingz soon sunk to the bottom of the NSL, essentially becoming cannon fodder for the rest of Australia to take points off week in, week out. The club's attendances declined, and it would spend seemingly its entire existence jumping from owner to owner, like a weird, hot Kiwi potato hybrid. It sounds awful. The club ended up in the hands of businessman Brian Katson at the end of the club's 2003-2004 season, a season where, predictably, the Kingz had finished dead last in the National Soccer League. However, change was afoot. After years of mismanagement and league finances in freefall, the reset button was pushed on Australian football and the National Soccer League. In 2005, it would relaunch afresh with the A-League, a brand spanking new professional league comprising of 8 privately owned franchise clubs, with the Kingz being one of them. But Katson realised that the Kingz brand wasn't exactly held in high regard. In fact, it was arguably toxic at this point. With the launch of the new A-League came an opportunity to rebrand the Kingz and salvage some credibility for New Zealand soccer. They wouldn't. And so, the Football Kingz regenerated to become the slightly less embarrassing but still pretty cringe New Zealand Knights. The name changed, the badge changed, the kit changed. A bit. But the results remain the same. Oh no, they weren't, they were even worse. In the inaugural A-League season, the New Zealand Knights ended their campaign with the impressive record of 1 win, 3 draws and 17 losses, finishing with a goal difference of -32, with the next closest team, Melbourne Victory, managing over 4 times the number of points in Auckland's finest. From a points per game perspective, they were even worse than 07-08 Derby County, amazingly. In the eyes of both the Australian and New Zealand media, the Knights were a joke, and local supporters seemed to agree. Despite promising early attendance figures, the crowds quickly disappeared, dropping to as low as just 2,000 people per match, well short of the 10,000 per game average the Football Federation of Australia was hoping for. The Knights would at least improve on finishing last in 05-06 by finishing last in 06-07, this time managing to at least look like they gave a shit. But behind the scenes, things were predictably dire. The club had run up massive debts and would soon come to blows with the Football Federation of Australia over the club's long-term sustainability. On December 14, 2006, the FFA officially announced that it had pulled the plug on the A-League licence held by the Knights owners. To ensure the season didn't descend into a complete shambles and that the players' contracts were actually paid, the FFA reached an emergency agreement with New Zealand Soccer, who agreed to step in and run the team's operations for the remaining 5 weeks of the regular season, viewing it as a necessary measure to avoid total embarrassment for the sport in New Zealand. Following the season's final match, the New Zealand Knights were formally dissolved, ending Auckland's first, rather messy, chapter in the A-League. Heading into the 2007-2008 season, the Football Federation of Australia hoped that the third time would indeed be the charm in their quest to break New Zealand. The FFA granted New Zealand Soccer a provisional licence to find a financially viable club to compete in the A-League. But, with just a few months before the start of the pre-season, there weren't exactly any obvious candidates, and the FFA began getting itchy feet. So much so that they even began negotiating with a Townsville-based group in northern Queensland named Tropical Football Australia. Thankfully, the rest of the A-League was spared a sweaty away fixture in the tropics. The saviour for New Zealand's spot in the league arrived in the form of Terry Serapisos, a Wellington property developer with the pockets deep enough to keep the dream alive. Well, he did at least at the time. Driven by a lifelong obsession with the beautiful game, Big Tezza coughed up the cash required for startup to keep the FFA happy. On March 19, 2007, the FFA finally signed off on a 3-year A-League licence for New Zealand football, which was promptly handed over to the brand new Wellington outfit, who would go on to be named, the actually rather tasteful for once, Wellington Phoenix. And just like the mythical bird, the Phoenix rose from the ashes of the Auckland Knights, soaring from last place in 06-07 to last place in 07-08. Oh wait, that doesn't really work. I mean, to be fair, what do you expect from a brand new team cobbled together in a few months? At least they were kind of competitive, and support remained fairly consistent. Over 14,000 fans attended Wellington's first match against defending champions Melbourne Victory at Westpac Stadium, and the Phoenix would welcome a near total of 117,000 fans for the opening 10 A-League matches. When the Wellington Phoenix invited David Beckham's LA Galaxy to town for a friendly in December of 2007, the club set a New Zealand soccer attendance record of nearly 32,000 supporters. But the best thing about the Phoenix was they didn't immediately crash and burn like the other New Zealand sides that came before them. After the initial poor impression left by the Phoenix, they would quickly rise up the A-League standings, making it to their first A-League final series in 2010, and, despite looking like they might get shafted by the league in the middle of the decade, the Phoenix would go on to firmly establish themselves as an A-League mainstay, carrying the flag as the only professional club in New Zealand until... By 2023, the A-League had expanded to 12 professional clubs spread across Australia and New Zealand. But league organisers weren't done yet. Even though Auckland, the biggest city across the two countries without an A-League side, had proven to be somewhat of an unhappy hunting ground for Australia's Premier Division, league organisers were still convinced that the city represented a lucrative, untapped metropolitan market. Enter American billionaire Bill Foley, owner of Bournemouth FC in England, Lorient FC in France, and probable owner of many fine suits. Ever since he was a young child, William Foley had dreamed of owning a New Zealand-based A-League franchise, and that dream would be made a reality in 2024, when Auckland FC were born. By positioning the club as part of his global footballing Avengers, and the financial backing that came with it, Mrs. Foley's baby boy had done everything he needed to convince the A-League suits to give Auckland another shot of glory. And sure enough, they did. 24,000 Aucklanders packed out the Mount Smart Stadium to watch Auckland FC's A-League debut victory over Brisbane Roar in October of 2024, and the club would go on to receive the highest average attendance of the 24-25 season. On the pitch, things were just as good. Auckland FC ended their inaugural season top of the A-League pile, though would miss out on the A-League title after defeat to Melbourne Victory in the final series, but just a year later, in May of 2026, Auckland FC became the first New Zealand club to win the Australian Men's National League. So, we can safely say that this cross-Tasman escapade into the A-League has been fantastic for New Zealand football then. Right? Well, let's look at that. If you consider things from the number of people playing association football, then things look great. The beautiful game is now the most popular participation sport in New Zealand, And while rugby is still the daddy when it comes to spectators, A-League attendances and viewerships are far greater than they were a couple of decades earlier, though having a professional side that's actually competitive will do that. However, from a footballing perspective, things are a little more blurred. While the A-League has provided a great platform to develop Kiwi players via Wellington Phoenix and Auckland FC, thus strengthening the quality of the New Zealand national team, the average level globally has increased as well. When the FIFA rankings launched in 1992, New Zealand were ranked as the 70th best team on the planet, and while the Kiwis peaked to as high as 47th in 2002 and 49th following their fabled undefeated World Cup campaign in 2010, New Zealand sunk to as low as 161st in 2016, and at time of blabbering, sit in 85th. They go into the 2026 World Cup as the lowest ranked team, zipping over to North America. As a remote country that is part of the Oceania Football Confederation, New Zealand rarely has opportunities to compete as a nation against top quality sides. Yes, a now basically guaranteed route into the World Cup is nice and all, but there's not much that can be learned from walloping Vanuatu or Samoa in the OFC Nations Cup or World Cup qualifying every few years. And with Australia creeping away to become part of the Asian Football Confederation as of 2006, those opportunities have gotten even fewer. It's also worth noting that while Wellington Phoenix and Auckland FC have been mixing it up with the Aussies, New Zealand football still has other clubs competing in its own restructured National Soccer League back home, which unfortunately has nowhere near the same level of exposure and financial backing as their big brothers competing in the A-League. Auckland City FC, not to be confused with Auckland FC in the A-League, are the competition's dominant force, winning 3 of the past 4 National League titles, the past 4 OFC Champions Leagues, and most recently getting demolished 10-0 in the Club World Cup by Bayern Munich. So, what's next for association football in New Zealand? Well, planned reforms to the National Soccer League in 2027, and the introduction of a brand new OFC Professional League consisting of 7 teams from Oceania, as well as, weirdly, South Melbourne, are attempts from New Zealand football and OFC as a whole to develop the game further in the region. As for the future of the New Zealand clubs in the A-League, well, despite a rocky start to the relationship with the Kings and the Knights disaster classes, the success of the franchise clubs in Wellington and Auckland has emboldened A-League bigwigs to see if they can milk the New Zealand footballing lamb any further. It wouldn't be at all far-fetched to imagine a third New Zealand side infiltrating the A-League, with Christchurch now being touted as a possible location for such a side. Football across the Tasman remains very much an alive, chaotic, ever-evolving entity. It doesn't always make sense, but the cross-Tasman experiment actually works. And with Auckland FC winning the big one, the presence of New Zealand in the A-League has proven it's here to stick around. Just don't mention the Knights.